What if the most powerful ghost story in modern history did not begin in a ruined castle or a cursed graveyard, but inside an ordinary wooden house where two young sisters claimed they could hear the dead knocking from inside the walls? That is exactly why stories of spirit calling have survived for centuries. They sit in the dangerous space between grief and hope, fear and curiosity, deception and belief. And when we look at the real cases, the story becomes even more fascinating. Because the truth is not simply that people wanted to speak with the dead. It is that entire societies were transformed by the idea that the dead might answer back. One of the most famous documented cases began in 1848 in Hydesville, New York, with the Fox sisters, Margaret and Catherine. According to later accounts, the family heard mysterious rapping sounds in their home. The girls claimed they could communicate with an unseen presence through coded knocks, turning strange noises into answers. That moment became the spark that helped launch the modern spiritualist movement, a movement that spread across the United States and Europe with astonishing speed. Public séances, spirit messages, trance mediums, and darkened parlors soon became part of mainstream culture, not some fringe obsession hidden in the shadows. Britannica identifies the Fox sisters as the figures whose séances triggered the huge mid-19th-century spiritualist craze, while the Smithsonian describes their case as the event that launched a mass religious movement. What made this story so powerful was not just the alleged haunting. It was timing. The 19th century was an age of scientific breakthroughs, industrial change, epidemics, and war. Death was common, sudden, and intimate. Families buried children. Wives lost husbands. Parents carried grief that had no language strong enough to contain it. In that emotional climate, the promise of a message from beyond the grave was not entertainment alone. It felt like relief. It felt like evidence that love had not been erased. That is one reason séances grew so quickly, and why they attracted not only the gullible, but also educated people, reformers, writers, and investigators who genuinely thought they might be witnessing a new frontier of human experience. The Society for Psychical Research was later founded in 1882 specifically to study claims like these in a more systematic way. And yet the Fox sisters' story also contains the twist that makes all true spirit-calling stories so compelling. Years later, one of the sisters publicly confessed that the famous rappings were produced by cracking joints, though the history remained complicated by later reversals and ongoing debate about what exactly was faked, exaggerated, or sincerely believed. That tension is the heart of this subject. Spirit calling is not powerful because it is easy to prove. It is powerful because it reveals how desperately human beings want the silence after death to mean something more. And once hope enters a room, reason and longing begin their oldest argument. If the Fox sisters opened the door, the next chapter showed just how wide that door could swing. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spirit calling had moved far beyond family parlors and frightened whispers. It entered theaters, private salons, newspapers, and intellectual debate. Mediums became celebrities. Skeptics became investigators. Even people known for logic and discipline found themselves pulled into the question no laboratory could fully silence. If the dead could speak, then religion, science, memory, and identity all had to be reimagined. That is why the subject refused to die. It was never only about ghosts. It was about whether consciousness itself could survive the grave. One of the most fascinating figures drawn into this world was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Few ironies in cultural history are more striking. The man who invented fiction's greatest master of deduction became one of the best-known defenders of spiritualism. After the devastation of the First World War and the influenza pandemic, belief in communication with the dead surged again. Millions were mourning. Entire families had been broken. In that landscape, séances were not just dramatic rituals. They became emotional lifelines. Conan Doyle believed that psychic phenomena offered genuine proof that death was not the end. His conviction was so strong that it eventually created a famous conflict with escape artist Harry Houdini, who spent years exposing fraudulent mediums while still grieving his own mother and longing for real contact beyond death. That clash between Conan Doyle and Houdini captures the emotional complexity of true spirit-calling stories better than almost any other case. One man believed because he saw meaning everywhere. The other doubted because he saw how easily pain could be exploited. Houdini attended séances, studied techniques, and revealed how tables could move, bells could ring, and ghostly hands could appear through hidden methods, careful staging, and psychological suggestion. Yet his skepticism was not cold indifference. It came from a deeper heartbreak. He wanted proof badly enough to hunt down every claim, and perhaps that is what made him such a dangerous enemy to fraud. His life reminds us that disbelief and longing are not opposites. Sometimes they are born from the same wound. Then there were the more elaborate séance stars of the era, figures like Eusapia Palladino in Europe and Mina Crandon in America, whose sessions attracted scientists, physicians, journalists, and psychical researchers. Witnesses described levitations, touches from invisible hands, voices in darkness, and objects moving without contact. Some observers came away convinced. Others discovered trickery, suspicious conditions, or outright deception. But the remarkable thing is not simply that some mediums cheated. It is that even when fraud was exposed, belief often survived. People continued attending. They continued hoping. They continued telling stories about one session that felt different from all the rest, one moment when the air changed, when a familiar voice seemed to return, when grief briefly turned into presence. That is the strange power of spirit calling in real history. It lives in the space where evidence remains contested but experience feels unforgettable. And once a person believes they have heard the dead answer, even for a second, ordinary skepticism can begin to feel painfully small. As the 20th century moved forward, spirit calling did not disappear under the light of modern science. In some ways, it became even more intriguing. The setting changed. Candlelit Victorian parlors gave way to radio studios, laboratory experiments, and popular cinema, but the central question remained untouched. Can the dead reach back? Or are the living creating voices out of memory, expectation, and pain? This is where the true stories become even more unsettling, because they no longer belong only to folklore. They begin touching psychology, neuroscience, religion, and the hidden mechanics of human perception. One reason these stories endure is that many people who report contact with the dead are not necessarily part of occult circles at all. They are widows who hear a familiar voice after a funeral. They are sons who dream of a parent with impossible clarity the night before important news arrives. They are ordinary people who describe a presence in the room at the exact moment someone they love passes away far away. Researchers in grief psychology have long noted that so-called bereavement experiences are remarkably common. For those who live through them, the experience often feels more real than memory and more intimate than imagination. That does not automatically prove a spirit has returned. But it does explain why spirit calling cannot be dismissed as mere superstition. It is deeply connected to how human beings process loss, attachment, and unfinished emotion. And this is where the mystery sharpens. Some experiences can be explained through suggestion, sleep states, pattern recognition, or the brain's desperate need to preserve bonds after death. Under stress, the mind is not a neutral machine. It searches for continuity. It fills silence with meaning. It notices small coincidences and turns them into messages. A knock in an empty house becomes an answer. A flickering light becomes a sign. A dream becomes a visitation. Yet, even that explanation does not fully remove the power of the experience. If the mind can create something so vivid that it changes a life, then the human mind itself becomes part of the mystery. This is why spirit calling has always lived at the border between external haunting and internal revelation. In some cultures, calling the dead is treated as sacred ritual, part of ancestor veneration and spiritual continuity. In others, it is feared as dangerous interference with a world best left alone. But across cultures, the emotional pattern is astonishingly similar. The living want reassurance. They want forgiveness. They want one last sentence that death interrupted too soon. And sometimes, when the ritual begins and silence gathers around the room, what matters most is not whether a ghost truly arrives. What matters is that everyone present feels, for a moment, that the wall between worlds has become thinner. That may be the deepest truth hidden inside these real stories. Spirit calling is not only about the dead. It is also about the living confronting the one mystery no civilization has ever solved. Death ends a voice, but it does not end the need to hear it again. In the end, the most haunting thing about true stories of spirit calling is not whether every knock, whisper, or shadow can be verified. It is that generation after generation, across different languages, religions, and eras, people keep returning to the same ritual with the same trembling hope. They darken the room. They quiet their breathing. They ask a question into the silence, not because silence is reasonable, but because silence is unbearable. And that is why these stories remain alive. They are not only paranormal tales. They are emotional documents of humanity refusing to accept that love, guilt, memory, and longing can simply vanish without a final reply. Look closely at the real history, and a pattern emerges. Some cases collapse under fraud. Some are sustained by coincidence, suggestion, or the astonishing creativity of the grieving mind. Some remain unresolved, suspended forever between testimony and doubt. But all of them reveal something real about us. They show that belief is rarely born from ignorance alone. More often, it is born from loss. A mother wants to hear her son once more. A husband wants one sign that his wife still exists somewhere beyond the visible world. A child wants to know death did not erase the voice that once made the world feel safe. In that sense, every séance, every whispered invocation, every attempt to call the dead is also a confession of human vulnerability. This is what gives the subject its strange dignity. It is easy to mock a table turning in candlelight, or a medium speaking in trance. It is harder to mock the pain that led people into that room. The history of spirit calling is filled not only with deception, but with sorrow, devotion, and an almost sacred refusal to let death have the final word. That is why even in an age of satellites, brain scans, and artificial intelligence, stories of summoning spirits still fascinate millions. Science can explain many mechanisms of perception. Psychology can explain grief responses. History can expose fraud. Yet none of these completely remove the emotional force of the question. What if one voice really did return? What if one answer truly came from beyond? Perhaps that is why the most powerful true stories are not the loudest, but the quietest. A single knock heard at the right moment. A dream that feels more vivid than waking life. A sentence spoken in darkness that no stranger should have known. These moments endure because they are small enough to feel personal and mysterious enough to resist easy closure. They remain suspended in memory like a half-open door. So when we talk about real stories of spirit calling, we are talking about more than the supernatural. We are talking about humanity's oldest negotiation with mortality. We are talking about the aching space between what can be proven and what can be felt. And maybe that is why the dead, whether they truly answer or not, continue to speak through history. Because the living have never stopped calling.